I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna shout, I'm gonna let the reason out that his love goes on forever. I'm gonna take it all the way.
This is the Maple Minute for Thursday, September the 15th, 2022. I'm Pastor Bill, and we've been talking about the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer, as Jesus instructed his disciples on how to pray. And that's an important aspect. We are talking today and going to try and answer the question, does God lead people into temptation? Now, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 13, where we're at, the Bible says that we should pray and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. You know, this prayer, this verse here, Jesus' model prayer might seem to imply that there are times when God does, in fact, lead us into temptation. Yet, if you study, and you have to always study the whole context of the Bible, study the whole Bible in its entirety, what we find is that God does not tempt people, his people at least. James, for instance, as he wrote, the half-brother of Jesus, he explained that God does not lead us into temptation or seduces people to sin. He says this over in James chapter 1, verse 13. He says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone." See, the Lord is not demanding our holiness while also tempting us to fail. He's not hoping that, oops, I hope you slip up. And that's how some people view God. God does not take delight in your sin, and he's not ready to throw you down and kick you in the gut because you do sin. That would be ridiculous. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for us. He suffered and agonized over this. So sin's a serious issue with him. See, he's not playing a cruel game with us. He does not push us to the brink of sin to see if we will turn and fall over the edge. So when Jesus says, lead us not into temptation, Jesus is not asking God to act in a way contrary to his nature, but in a way entirely consistent with his holiness. See, Jesus is asking God to lead him away from evil and away from the lusts of his own flesh. That's what he's saying in that prayer. And that's the prayer that we should pray. Pray that God would lead us away from evil, that God would lead us away from our own lusts, our own sinful desires of our flesh. See, while God will never tempt us, God will sometimes test us in order to strengthen our faith. James, go back to him, this is what he said in verses before what we read. James chapter 1, verse 2, he said, "Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials," different word, not temptations, but trials of many kinds, tests, that would be it. "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." And that's something we talked about last time, how we can make it through, how we can carry through. See, we often confuse God's tests with temptations. Why? Because, I failed to read verse 4. Verse 4, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you can be mature and complete, not lacking anything." But we often fail God's tests because our hearts often use difficult circumstances as an excuse for sinful behavior. And that's a problem. See, you know, it was easy to blame the devil. No, he didn't make you do it. Sorry about that one. And it's easy to say, hey, I just couldn't help myself because it's so hard. I understand that. The difference between a test and trial, and let me help you with this one. A test is a trying circumstance or a difficult situation orchestrated in our lives by God. A temptation, however, though, and here's the difference, a temptation is an invitation to sin. It's not a sin, but it's an invitation to. An encouragement, it's an encouragement to engage in something that's contrary to God's law, God's line in the sand. God certainly tests us, but he never tempts us. And in Jesus' model prayer here about this temptation, there are 4 truths that we can come out of this that help develop our theology about who God is. Number 1, temptations are a real daily threat to our life with Christ. They are. That's why we have to pray, lead us not into temptation, because sin is there. That's what he told Cain. Sin is knocking at your door, and don't, because it's going to try and overpower you. It's going to try and be your master, because that's the whole idea. So we need to, first of all, understand what Jesus is saying here when he says, lead us not in temptation. He's saying it's a real deal, and it's a daily threat to our life with Christ. Number 2, he would tell us we're not able to resist temptation by our own power. That's true. See, apart from God, we are simply unable to resist temptation, and that's why we need God. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, Paul dealt with this, and he talked about that God is able. God is able, and that's the truth of that whole verse there. God is able in everything we do. Verse number 3, we'd say this: we must pray for endurance in the fight against temptation. That's what Jesus is teaching us here. See, we must realize that we are in a fight. We talked about that in a previous episode. And it's a lifelong struggle, and we have to make sure we're ready for this. And so just like any athlete will prepare for the competition they're going to do, you wouldn't just walk in out of shape and not ready. You'd have to be ready for the fight, and that's the whole idea. And then number 4, pray that the Lord delivers us from our own personal patterns of temptation. See, here's what I understand is each one of us because each one of us are unique, we each have our unique sins that are alluring to us, enticing to us, that are what we call personal patterns of temptation. Not everybody's a cookie cutter, same kind of deal. So some things are specific to you and your personality type. And so we should not pray against temptation generically in a generic form, but we should be specific in our prayers about the enticements of sin that really affect us. Some people have different sins issues that pop up in their mind. So don't just generically say, God, help me from everything. No, be specific with us, and that's what he's talking about. So as we finish out today, let me ask you a couple questions to help you think it over. First of all, have you ever thought that a temptation wasn't real? Why or why not? Why do we sometimes not believe temptations are a threat to our daily lives? I know people that just sort of, balk at the fact that there are temptations. And in fact, they claim spiritual arrogance because they've been saved for so long. I wish that was true, but it's not. So why do we sometimes not believe temptations are a threat to our daily lives? Secondly, what do you think is the reason a temptation might overwhelm you? How do you usually handle temptations? And that's such an important thing that we should do and think about. How are you going to handle temptation? What do you need to do? And then last of all, what are your patterns of temptation? We talked about personal patterns of temptation. And remember, temptation is not sin. It's what leads us into sin. Temptation is a doorway. It's an invitation to sin. Have you ever thought about personal struggles with enticing sins in light of a pattern? Why do you think some people ignore this? And it's so important that we should see the patterns. And that's one of the struggles, especially for addicts. And we're all addicts when it comes to sin. We have to see the pattern of our addiction to sin and help pray to God that he can give us the strength to face those and remove those patterns from us and help us through those problem areas of our lives. So I hope this has been a benefit to you, and I hope you've learned something about temptations versus tests, and that God does not tempt us. Sometimes he sends circumstances to strengthen our faith, which are tests, but he doesn't tempt us ever to do evil, to do sin. So until next time, thanks for joining me here on the Maple Minute. Make sure you like our post, share it out with your friends so they can benefit from it too. And if you're not a subscriber, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Make sure you hit the notification button so you get all the instant updates and don't miss any of our videos. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm gonna praise Jesus' name, 'cause his love goes on forever.